Thank you, Deborah. So nice to be back in Ketchum. You know, I went to a Jimmy Buffett concert in Santa Barbara recently, and he opened it up by saying that he plays in a lot of places like Cincinnati and Des Moines, but he says, what I really do is I like to play near the ocean. That's what I'm interested in, is surf cities. And I like to talk about wilderness near the wilderness, you know, and so I'm really happy to be back in Ketchum and see my friends here. How many of you people have run the Middle Fork of the Salmon? Yeah. All right, good. How many have run the Grand Canyon? Yeah. See that? This is great. If you haven't done it, get down there soon. Just highlight a couple things that I think are special about Wild Gift, the Bob Jonas idea, and the achievement of these four leaders this year and their excellent guides. And that is, I want to talk about what we can learn from wilderness. What we can learn that we can't learn in a kind of regular garden variety, corporate sponsored entrepreneur course. What about the trek? What about going in there that's special and that's different? And that's what I want to talk about a little bit. Some of the things that can be learned. And one of them, I think, is we can learn what Henry David Thoreau was talking about when he talked about living a balanced life between the wild and the civilized. Thoreau, you know, wrote Walden, and he went to Walden Pond in 1845, and he talked a lot in that book in metaphors, and one of the great metaphors I think he used was that of his half-cultivated bean field. He said, I've got this bean field, and it's not fully cultivated, but it's still productive. And what he was doing, of course, was creating a metaphor for himself and for American civilization, that it should be half cultivated, that it should have some civilization involved, but also some wildness, and that we shouldn't completely sell our souls to the civilized way. And that was a lesson that we can learn from wilderness, that we can go back in there and we can come out and bring with us the vitality, the vigor that comes out of a wild environment. Thoreau almost talked about wildness as a fertilizer, that you could pour on sand and you could grow a fine crop like that bean field. But if you didn't have that wild fertilizer, then it was anemic and it was a poor crop. So he said we needed both. We can also learn from another one of my heroes in the American wilderness movement, a man who founded the Sierra Club in 1892, and a man who was responsible really for Yosemite National Park in 1890, and that was John Muir. And we can learn from John Muir that wilderness is a cathedral, that for a long time we regarded with fear and loathing as a place that was cursed, as a place where God punished people by driving them into a wilderness, expelling them from the Garden of Eden. And maybe we realize with Joni Mitchell that it really is a garden that they were expelled into, and that was a wild place. So it was somebody like Muir who changed attitudes from fear and loathing to cathedral mountains. Remember John Denver? Talked about cathedral mountains. I climbed cathedral mountains. So did John Muir, and he used those kinds of metaphors. We can also learn from Theodore Roosevelt, another hero, who taught us that the American character and American culture has been shaped by the wilderness, that Europeans came in, but what emerged after the frontier process was something different and maybe something better, and maybe something that needed wilderness to sustain it. And we can learn that kind of thing on a trek too. And finally, we can come to a less anthropocentric, more ecocentric perspective of a man like Aldo Leopold, one of the founders of the wilderness movement in the Forest Service, a man who talked about a land ethic, a man who reminded us that our ethics shouldn't just stop with human beings, but it should extend onto all living things, that the concept of community was not just people, but was everything that lived in the Big Wood Valley, for example. Leopold had a wonderful way of putting it. He said, you've got to think like a mountain. I think these leaders who've been out there learned to think like a mountain by being out in the mountains And thinking like a mountain meant you've got to understand the importance of wolves, that they belong too. And that's a hard sell in parts of Idaho, but it may be a little easier after experience like they've had out there. So what we can learn from the wilderness, and this is what I want you to take away from here tonight, along with the kebabs, is that wilderness is a gesture of planetary modesty. When we preserve wilderness, we exercise restraint. We create a legacy of limitation. The old frontiersmen conquered the wilderness. The new frontiersmen and women conquer themselves and conquer their tendency of their culture to become over-civilized and self-defeating. Wilderness as a place where we learn to share, a lesson we haven't learned real well as a species, but we learn to share this beautiful planet with other forms of life. We learn that wild or self-willed forms of life, did you ever think of that? That's where the word wild comes from the word will, something that's free, that has its own free will, that is self-willed, i.e. wild, and we learn that we can respect that quality. So I usually like to wrap up with a personals ad that some of my students at Santa Barbara wrote with me years ago. This is kind of something that might appear in eharmony.com for the universe. Let's say we had an eharmony.com and it was universal, okay? And we're going to put a little entry on the computer, going to keyboard in a little something, and we're going to see what happens. And here's the way the one we wrote reads. It says, temperate but endangered planet, enjoys weather, photosynthesis, evolution, continental drift, seeks caring long-term relationship with intelligent life form. Think about that. Caring long-term relationship with intelligent life form. Maybe it could be us. Maybe it still could be us. An organization like Wild Gift gives me hope that it could be. Thank you for coming. I'll be around. Love to talk to you.